The Case of the Murder on D Hill. Rampo Edogawa. Part 1. The Facts. It was on a sultry evening in early September. I was at my usual haunt, a cafe called Hakubaiken, located midway along the main street of D Hill, sipping a glass of iced coffee. At the time, I had only just graduated from school, had yet to find any steady employment, and spent my days either lounging about my boarding house with a book or wandering the streets aimlessly, killing time in cheap cafes. Hakubaiken was close to my lodgings, and conveniently situated along whatever route my strolls might take, so naturally I frequented it more than any other. Unfortunately, I had the bad habit of lingering too long once inside a cafe. My appetite was small to begin with, and my purse was none too full, so I would never order a plate of Western food, but rather nurse 2 or 3 cups of coffee over the course of an hour or two. Not that I was flirting with the waitresses or harbored any special affection for them, far from it. It was simply that cafes felt livelier, more comfortable than my dreary boarding house. That evening was no different. I took my usual seat by the window overlooking the street and idly gazed outside while drawing out the last drops of a single cup of iced coffee for 10 minutes at a time. Now, D Hill, where Hakubaiken stood, was once a famous spot for chrysanthemum doll displays. The narrow street had only recently been widened by the city into what they proudly called a multi-ken boulevard. At that time, however, there were still empty lots scattered here and there along its sides, giving the area a desolate air compared to today. Directly across the boulevard from Hakubaiken stood a secondhand bookstore. It was, in fact, this shopfront that had held my gaze for some time. It was a shabby little backstreet bookshop, hardly worth staring at, yet it held for me a certain peculiar interest. You see, I had recently become acquainted at Hakubaiken with a rather strange fellow by the name of Kogoro Akechi. He was clearly eccentric, with a keen mind, and what endeared him to me most, a great lover of detective fiction. From him I had learned that one of his childhood friends, a woman, had married the proprietor of that very bookstore. I had purchased a book or two there myself, and remembered that the bookseller's wife was quite a beauty, difficult to say exactly why, but she possessed a certain sensual allure. Since she was always said to mind the shop in the evenings, I was sure she must be there that night as well, and I kept scanning the cramped shop front barely 2.5 ken wide for a glimpse of her. But no one appeared. Just as I was about to give up and let my gaze wander to the neighboring clock shop, I noticed the sliding paper door between the shop and the back room being shut tight. This was a special kind of shoji called muso. The central papered section was fitted instead with 2 sets of narrow vertical slats that could be opened or closed for peeking through. How strange. Bookshops are an easy target for shoplifters, so even if no one tends the front, someone is usually in the back, keeping watch through those slats. To shut them completely was most peculiar. It was not as if the season required keeping out the cold. It was early September, stiflingly hot. That shoji being firmly shut struck me as odd indeed. And the more I thought on it, the more it seemed that something was happening in that back room. I could not take my eyes away. I recalled, too, a curious rumor I had once overheard from the waitresses at Hakubaiken. They had been swapping gossip overheard at the bathhouse. "The bookseller's wife may look so beautiful," one said, "but when she's undressed, her body is covered with bruises, marks of beatings, or pinches, no doubt. Strange, when she and her husband don't seem to quarrel." Another chimed in, "Why, even the wife of Asahiya the soba shop shows bruises often. Surely those too are from beatings." At the time I had dismissed it, perhaps the husbands were simply rough men, I thought. But readers, it was not so simple. That trifling rumor was later to prove of great importance to the entire affair. Be that as it may, I continued to stare at the shop for a good half hour. Call it a premonition if you will, but I felt sure that the moment I looked away, something would happen. I simply could not tear my eyes from it. Just then, none other than Akechi Kogoro himself came striding past the window in his usual coarse-striped yukata, his odd gait, swinging his shoulders from side to side. He noticed me, gave a slight nod, and stepped inside. Ordering an iced coffee, he sat down beside me, facing the window as I did. When he noticed how intently I was staring at something, he followed my gaze and fixed his eyes on the secondhand bookstore across the way. Strangely enough, he too seemed deeply interested, staring at it without the slightest distraction. We sat there, as though by tacit agreement, staring at the same spot while exchanging idle chatter. I have long since forgotten the exact topics we touched on. It matters little to this story anyway, but I do remember that the talk was certainly of crime and detection. To give a sample, do you suppose an absolutely undiscoverable crime is possible? Akechi asked. I rather think it might be. Take Unichiro Tanizaki's Tojo, On the Way, for example. That sort of crime would hardly ever come to light. True, in the novel, the detective solves it, but that was merely the product of the author's marvelous imagination. No, I don't agree, I replied. Perhaps not in practice, but in theory, there is no crime that a detective could not uncover. It's simply that our police today lack a detective of the caliber that appears in Tojo. So went our discussion. Yet suddenly, as if on cue, both of us fell silent. Something curious was happening at the secondhand bookshop across the street, which we had not ceased to watch, even while speaking. You've noticed too, haven't you? I whispered. Yes, he answered instantly. Book thieves. Strange, isn't it? I've been watching since I came in. That makes the fourth one. 4? But you've only been here less than half an hour. 4 and 30 minutes is a bit odd. You see, I was watching even before you arrived about an hour ago. That shoji, with the lattice work, you see it? I saw the slats being closed then, and since that moment, I've been keeping a close watch. Perhaps someone left the house? No, that shoji has never once been opened. If anyone left, it must have been through the back door. But still, to leave the place unattended for half an hour is strange indeed. What do you say? Shall we take a look? Yes, let's. Even if nothing has happened inside, something may have occurred outside. I confess I stepped out of the cafe, almost hoping it might prove to be a crime. Akechi must have felt the same. He was visibly excited. The bookshop was of the common type. The entire floor was earthen, with towering bookshelves along the front and side walls, their lower sections forming counters for displaying books. In the center stood a long rectangular table piled with more volumes. To the right of the front shelves was a 3-foot-wide passage leading to the back room, closed off by the shoji I had mentioned before. Usually the shopkeeper or his wife would be seated on a half-tatami mat, spread just before this door, keeping watch. Akechi and I stepped up to this little mat and called loudly. No answer. Evidently no one was there. I slid the shoji open a crack and peered inside. The room was dark. The light had been switched off, but in one corner, I thought I could make out a figure lying on the floor. Alarmed, I called again. Still no reply. Never mind the niceties. Let's go in, Akechi urged. So we both clattered into the back room. Akechi turned the switch. Instantly the room blazed with light, and simultaneously we both cried out, "Ah!" In the corner of the room lay the body of a woman, the bookseller's wife. I managed to say at last. Look, her neck seems to have been strangled. Akechi bent over the corpse to examine it. No chance of resuscitation. We must inform the police at once. I'll run to the public telephone. You stay here and keep watch. Don't alert the neighbors, lest we destroy vital clues." Giving his orders in this peremptory fashion, he rushed out toward the telephone box half a block away. For my part, though I had often discoursed glibly on crime and detection, this was the first time I had ever come face to face with the real thing. I was utterly at a loss. All I could do was stare around the room in a daze. It was a single 6-mat room. At the rear, on the right-hand side, a narrow veranda looked out onto a tiny garden of about 2 tsubo and a lavatory. Beyond that, a wooden fence enclosed the yard. It being summer, the shoji were left open, giving a full view. To the left, a sliding door opened onto a small 2-mat space with a sink and a back entrance. Its waist-high shoji were closed. To the right stood 4 closed fusuma sliding doors, behind which, I supposed, were the stairs to the 2nd floor and a storeroom. Altogether, it was the most ordinary of cheap row house floor plans. The body lay near the left-hand wall, the head toward the shop front. I kept my distance partly from a desire not to disturb the scene, partly from dread, but in such a small room one could hardly avoid seeing it. The woman wore a rough patterned yukata and lay almost on her back. Her garment had ridden up above her knees, baring her thighs, but there was little sign of a struggle. Around her neck, faint but distinct, was a purplish mark where she had been strangled. Outside, the bustle of the boulevard continued unabated. Passers-by shouted to one another, geta clattered. Drunkards bellowed the latest popular songs. A world at peace. Yet here, separated from that carefree noise by nothing but a thin paper screen, lay a woman strangled to death. The irony of it struck me with a peculiar sentimentality, and I stood there dumbfounded. "They'll be here soon," Akechi said, breathless, returning from his errand. "Ah, good," I answered weakly, finding even speech an effort. We looked at one another in silence for a long moment. Before long, a uniformed officer arrived, accompanied by a man in a suit. The former, I later learned, was the judicial officer from K police station. The latter, by his face and instruments, was plainly the station's medical examiner. We recounted the sequence of events to the judicial officer from the beginning, and I added, "When Akechi here entered the cafe, I happened to glance at the clock. It was about 8:30. Therefore, I believe the lattice of that shoji was closed around 8 o'clock. At that time, the light was certainly on inside. Thus, at least until 8 o'clock, a living person must have been in this room." While the judicial officer was taking down our statements in his notebook, the police surgeon had finished a preliminary examination of the body. Waiting for us to pause, he said, "Strangulation, with bare hands. Look here, these purplish marks are from the fingers, and these bleeding spots are where the nails dug in. Since the thumb mark is on the right side of the neck, it was done with the right hand. I'd say at least an hour has passed since death. In any case, there is no prospect of revival." "Pinned from above, then?" the judicial officer mused. "Even so, there are no signs of resistance. It must have been done very suddenly, with tremendous force." He turned to us and asked where the master of the house might be. Of course, we had no idea. Akechi, thinking quickly, went to fetch the owner of the clock shop next door. The exchange between the judicial officer and the clockmaker went roughly as follows. "Where has the proprietor gone?" "He puts out a night stall of second-hand books every evening, sir, and never gets back before around midnight." "Where does he set up?" "Often over on Ueno's Hirokoji, I believe. Where he's gone tonight, I couldn't say." "About an hour ago, did you hear anything? Any sounds?" "What sort of sounds, sir?" "The obvious kind. A woman's scream as she's killed, the noise of a struggle." "I can't say I heard anything out of the ordinary." Meanwhile, word had spread. Neighbors gathered, and together with passers-by, the front of the shop swelled into a crowd. Among them came the proprietress of the tabi shop on the other side, who backed up the clockmaker. She, too, stated she had heard nothing. The neighbors, after conferring, seemed to have sent someone to fetch the bookseller from his stall. Just then an automobile pulled up out front, and several men came bustling in the court officials summoned by the urgent police report, along with the chief of K police station and, as fate would have it, the much-talked-of ace detective of the day, Inspector Kobayashi. All this I learned afterward. A judicial reporter friend of mine was close to Kobayashi, who later told him the details. The judicial officer who had arrived first briefed the newcomers on what had transpired so far. We, too, had to repeat our earlier statements. Shut the front shutters. A man barked suddenly, a fellow in a black alpaca jacket and white trousers, looking more like a low-level company clerk than a policeman. Without waiting, he strode over and began sliding the door shut. This was Inspector Kobayashi. Having thus driven off the rubberneckers, he set to work. His manner was high-handed. The prosecutor and the station chief might as well not have existed. From start to finish, he acted alone. The others seemed present merely to observe his quick, nimble movements. He began with the body, paying particular attention to the neck. "There's nothing distinctive in these finger marks," he said, glancing toward the prosecutor. "They tell us only that an ordinary person pressed down with the right hand." Next, he announced he would need to inspect the corpse unclothed. Like a parliamentary secret session, we, spectators, were ushered out to the shop area. What they discovered then, I cannot say with certainty, but it's clear they must have noted the many fresh wounds on the woman's body, the very marks the cafe waitresses had gossiped about. Presently, the secret session ended, though Akechi and I refrained from stepping back into the room. From the half-tatami at the threshold, we peered in. Fortunately for us, as the discoverers of the crime, and because they would need Akechi's fingerprints later, we were not expelled entirely. Indeed, detained is perhaps the better word. Kobayashi's activity was not confined to the back room. He ranged widely indoors and out. Even so, we got a surprisingly full sense of the investigation, for the prosecutor planted himself in the back room and scarcely moved. Each time the inspector came and went, he reported his findings, which we heard in full. The clerk set them down for the record. First came a search of the room where the body lay. No abandoned property, no footprints, nothing a detective's eye could seize on. Nothing, that is, save one thing. "There are fingerprints on the light switch," said the inspector, dusting the black ebonite plate with a white powder. From the circumstances, the person who turned off the lamp must be the culprit. Who turned it on? Akechi said it had been he. "Very well. We'll take your prints in a moment. We'll remove the switch as is no one touch it." The inspector then went upstairs and stayed a while. When he came down, he immediately said he would examine the alley and stepped out. Perhaps 10 minutes later, he returned, a lit flashlight in one hand, and brought with him a man filthy crepe shirt, khaki trousers, around 40, unkempt. "The footprints are useless," the inspector reported. "By this back door, it's a mire. No sun gets in here and it's riddled with sandal marks. Impossible to make anything of them. As for this fellow," he pointed at the man, "he's the ice cream seller with his cart at the corner where this alley opens. If the killer fled by the back door, the alley is one way. He'd have had to pass this man's eyes. Now then, let me put my questions again." The inspector questioned the ice cream vendor. "Did anyone go in or out of this alley around 8 o'clock? "Not a soul, sir. Since dusk, why, not even a cat's come through. I've had my stand here a long while, sir. The housewives from this row rarely pass at night. Never mind that the footing's bad. It's pitch dark besides." "Any customers of yours go into the alley?" "No, sir. Everyone ate their ice cream right there in front of me and went back the way they'd come. I'm quite certain." If the vendor's testimony could be trusted, then even if the murderer had used the back door, He did not exit by the alley, the only route from that door. And as for the front, we ourselves had eyes on it from the White Plum Cafe. No one left that way either. What then? Kobayashi reasoned that the culprit must either be hiding in one of the houses that face onto this alley, front or back rows, or else be among the tenants themselves. True, he might have escaped over the rooftops from the second floor, but an inspection upstairs showed the front windows fitted with fixed grills, unmoved, and in back, on a sweltering night like this, every house keeps its upstairs open. Some people even sitting out by the drying poles to catch a breeze. Escape that way seemed rather difficult. At that point, the investigators held a brief discussion about how to proceed. In the end, they decided to divide up and search each house in the neighborhood, door to door. But since there were only 11 houses in total, counting both rows of tenements front and back, it was not such a burdensome task. At the same time, they searched the inside of the used bookshop again, from under the floorboards to the ceiling loft, leaving no corner unchecked. Yet the results yielded not only nothing useful, but seemed only to make matters more perplexing. For instance, it came out that the confectioner 2 doors down from the bookshop had been out on his rooftop drying area, playing his shakuhachi, from dusk until just a little while earlier. He had been seated in such a position that it was impossible for him to miss anything happening at the second-floor windows of the bookshop. Readers, you can see the case was growing more and more curious. Where did the culprit enter, and where did he escape? Not by the back door, not by the upstairs windows, and certainly not by the front. Was he never there at all? Or did he vanish like smoke? Nor was that the only mystery. Detective Kobayashi brought in 2 students who lodged in the back row of tenements, students at a technical school, who made an extraordinary statement. They did not seem like the sort of fellows to make things up, and yet what they told only deepened the riddle. In response to the prosecutor's questions, they gave roughly the following testimony. At about 8 o'clock, I was standing in front of the bookshop, flipping through a magazine on the display stand. Then I heard some noise from the back, so I looked up toward the sliding screen. The screen itself was closed, but the latticed opening in it was ajar. Through the gap, I saw a man standing there. But as I raised my eyes, he slid the lattice shut almost at the same moment, so of course I couldn't make out details. Still, from the sash, I am certain it was a man. And besides knowing it was a man, did you notice anything else? His build? His clothing? I only saw him from the waist down, so I couldn't judge his height. He was wearing black, perhaps a fine stripe or a kind of kasuri pattern, but to my eyes, it looked plain black. The second student said, I was with my friend, looking at books too. I also noticed the noise and saw the lattice being closed, but the man was definitely wearing white, a solid white garment, with no stripes or pattern. That's strange. One of you must be mistaken. No, I'm not mistaken. Nor am I lying. What was the meaning of this curious contradiction? Readers with sharp instincts may already have guessed something. In fact, I myself sensed it then. But the court officials and police seemed not to think too deeply about this point. Before long, the bookshop owner himself returned, summoned by the neighbors. He was a frail, youthful man, hardly looking the part of a bookseller. When he saw his wife's corpse, he burst into tears, though quietly, as if too timid to cry aloud. Inspector Kobayashi waited until he had calmed a little, then began questioning him, with the prosecutor adding words here and there. But to their disappointment, the man insisted he had no idea who the culprit could be. She was the very last person who would have earned anyone's enmity, he said, weeping. Furthermore, it was clear the crime was not a simple robbery. So they investigated the husband's background, the wife's family, and so on. But nothing suspicious came to light, nothing worth detailing here, for it bore little on the story. Finally, the inspector asked about the many bruises and wounds on the woman's body. The husband hesitated greatly, but at last admitted he had inflicted them himself. Yet, even when pressed, he gave no clear explanation as to why. In any case, since it was proven that he had been away tending his night stall the whole evening, those wounds, whether evidence of cruelty or not, could not implicate him in the murder. Perhaps for that reason, the inspector did not pursue the matter further. And so the night's inquiry came to a close. We gave our names and addresses. Akechi's fingerprints were taken, and by the time we were allowed to leave, it was past 1 o'clock. If the police investigation had been thorough, and if the witnesses spoke the truth, then this was truly a baffling case. And indeed, as I later learned, despite all the subsequent inquiries conducted over the following days by Inspector Kobayashi, then hailed as a master detective, the case never advanced a step beyond that first night. The witnesses were all trustworthy. None of the 11 households showed anything suspicious. Even the victim's family in the countryside were investigated, but nothing out of the ordinary was found. As long as Kobayashi had applied his full powers, the only possible conclusion was that the case remained completely inexplicable. Even the one piece of evidence, the light switch, which he had pinned his hopes on, proved useless. The only fingerprints on it were Akechi's. In his haste that night, he had left many prints, but they were all his own. The inspector judged that Akechi's prints must have overwritten those of the culprit. Readers, perhaps you are reminded of Poe's murder in the Rue Morgue, or Doyle's speckled band. Might the culprit have been no human at all, but something of the order of an orangutan or an Indian snake? I confess, I too thought of it. Yet it was hardly likely such creatures lurked around D Hill in Tokyo. And besides, there was the eyewitness who had seen a man's figure through the lattice. Moreover, an ape would have left tracks and surely been spotted. And the marks on the woman's throat were undeniably those of human fingers, not the coils of a serpent. Be that as it may, Akechi and I walked homeward together that night, deeply excited, discussing the case at length. To give just one example. You know, don't you, of the Rose Delacourt affair in Paris? The one that inspired Poe's Rue Morgue and Leroux's Yellow Room? Even now, a century later, it remains unsolved. Tonight's case, with the murderer leaving no trace of exit, bears a strange resemblance. Yes, extraordinary. People often say that Japanese houses make it impossible for the sort of profound crimes we read about in Western detective fiction to occur. But clearly, that isn't so. Here we have such a case before us. I don't know if I can do it, but I feel a strong desire to try my hand at investigating it. So we parted at a side street. I still remember how his back, clad in that gaudy striped yukata, stood out vividly in the darkness as he strode away in his peculiar shoulder-swinging gait. Part 2. Reasoning. Some 10 days after the murder, I went to visit Akechi Kogoro at his lodgings. From our conversation that day, the reader will easily gather what Akechi and I had done, thought, and concluded about the case in those 10 days. Up to that point, I had only ever met him at cafes, and it was the first time I had visited his home. But I had already learned the address, so finding the place was not difficult. I stopped before the tobacco shop that matched the description and asked the lady of the house whether Akechi was in. "Yes, he is here. Please wait a moment. I'll call him down." So saying, she walked over to the foot of the stairs, which were visible from the storefront, and called out loudly for Akechi. He rented the second floor of this house. "Ho," came his odd reply, and soon I heard him creaking down the stairs. When he spotted me, he looked surprised and said, "Ah, do come up." I followed him upstairs, but the moment I stepped into his room, I cried out in astonishment. The room was too bizarre. I already knew Akechi was an eccentric, but this was beyond eccentricity. It was nothing less than a 4.5 mat room, completely filled with books. Only a small patch of tatami in the center was visible. The rest was mounds of volumes. Along the walls and sliding doors, books were stacked like embankments, so densely at the base that they nearly filled the room, narrowing toward the top until they almost touched the ceiling, hemming one in on all 4 sides. There was no other furniture whatsoever. One could scarcely imagine how he managed to sleep there. Indeed, there was hardly room for 2 people to sit, and if one shifted carelessly, one risked triggering a landslide of books that might bury him alive. "I'm afraid it's cramped, and I have no cushions," Akechi said. "Forgive me, but please sit atop one of these softer piles." I pushed into the mounds and managed to find a perch, and for a time I could do nothing but gaze about me in wonder. I must here offer some description of the man who occupied this eccentric chamber. My acquaintance with him was still recent, so I knew nothing of his background, how he made his living, what goals he pursued in life. But it was certain he had no fixed occupation. One might call him a student of sorts, though a highly peculiar one. I recall him once saying, "I study human beings." At the time, I could not grasp what he meant. What was clear, however, was that he possessed an extraordinary interest in crime and detection, and a formidable store of knowledge on the subject. He was about my own age, not yet 25, lean of build, and, as I have mentioned, with a peculiar habit of swinging his shoulders when he walked. It was not the swagger of a bold man, but rather, strangely enough, it reminded one of Kanda Hakuryu, the one-armed lecturer, an odd comparison, but accurate. Indeed, Akechi resembled Hakuryu not only in gait, but in facial features and even voice. For those readers who have not seen Hakuryu, imagine not exactly a handsome man, but one with a certain charm, a face with something of genius about it. That was Akechi. His hair, however, was much longer, an unruly, tangled mass that he would often rake with his fingers as he talked, making it even more disheveled. His clothing showed little concern for appearances. Always a cotton kimono, tied with a limp, wrinkled sash. "You came at just the right time. We haven't seen each other for a while. But how about that case on D Slope? The police don't seem to have the slightest clue about the culprit, do they?" As he said this, Akechi scratched at his unruly hair in his usual fashion, peering at me intently. "In fact," I began, hesitating over how best to broach the matter, "I came today precisely to speak with you about that." "I see. Well, that sounds most interesting. I'd very much like to hear it in detail." In his gaze, I thought I detected a blend of skepticism and complacency, as if to say, "What could you possibly know?" Oddly enough, that hint of contempt steeled my resolve. I pressed on with energy. After that night, I did quite a bit of thinking. Not just thinking. Mind you, I carried out investigations, like a real detective. And in fact, I've reached a certain conclusion. I've come here to report it to you first, before I present it to the police. "Oh? Splendid. Let's hear it." "Well then, you recall, don't you, how those 2 students gave completely contradictory statements about the suspect's clothing? One swore it was black, the other white. However unreliable the human eye may be, mistaking black for white is strange indeed. I don't know how the police interpreted it, but I believe neither of them was mistaken. Do you understand? The man was wearing a garment striped in both black and white sei, a cotton yukata with thick vertical stripes, the kind one often sees as bathhouse or inn livery. Now, why did one student see it as pure white, while the other saw it as solid black? Because they glimpsed him through the narrow slats of the lattice. At that instant, By sheer coincidence, one had his view lined up with a white stripe, the other with a black. Rare, perhaps, but by no means impossible. And in this case, it is the only explanation that makes sense. So we know the suspect wore a boldly striped yukata. That narrows the field, but it does not yet identify the man. My second line of reasoning concerns the fingerprint on the electric switch. Through my newspaper man friend, I persuaded Inspector Kobayashi to let me study it carefully. That fingerprint, which the police say is yours. And from it, I confirmed beyond doubt that my theory was correct. By the way, do you have an inkstone I might borrow? I then carried out a small experiment. I took the inkstone, dipped my right thumb lightly in ink, and pressed a print onto a sheet of paper. After letting it dry, I inked the thumb again and pressed it once more on the very same spot, this time at a slightly different angle and with deliberate force. The result was 2 sets of ridges, clearly overlapping. You see, the police assume your print obliterated the killers, but that is impossible. Fingerprints consist of fine ridges. However strongly one presses, if a print already exists, its lines remain visible between the ridges of the new one. Only if the second print were laid down in precisely the same position as the first, each line perfectly coinciding, could it wholly cover the original, and such coincidence is all but impossible. Even if, by chance, that miracle alignment occurred, the conclusion remains unchanged. The only print on that switch is yours. When I examined it myself, there was not the faintest trace of another print beneath. So whether before or after, the only one who touched that switch was you. Why no trace of the bookseller or his wife? Likely because the lamp had been left burning all along and was never switched off until that night. What then do all these facts tell us? I see it this way. A man in a bold striped yukata, perhaps, say, the dead woman's childhood friend, one who may have turned vengeful after a lost love, knew that the bookseller would be absent at his night stall, and in that interval, attacked her. Since there were no signs of cries or resistance, she must have known him well. Having achieved his aim, the man extinguished the light in order to delay discovery of the body and left the house. But his one fatal misstep was failing to realize the lattice was open, so that when he hurried to close it, he was spotted by the 2 students who happened to be browsing outside. Now, the man at first went away, but then it struck him. The moment he extinguished the light, he must have left his fingerprint on the switch. That was something he absolutely had to erase. Yet, it was far too dangerous to break into the house again by the same method. So he conceived a brilliant stratagem. He himself would become the discoverer of the crime. In that way, he could return naturally, turn on the light in front of others, and thus erase suspicion of the fingerprint. Besides, who would ever suspect that the one who discovered the crime was in fact the criminal? It served him doubly well, and so he stood by, feigning innocence, calmly watching the police at work, even giving testimony boldly. And what came of it? Precisely what he wished. 5 days passed, 10 days, and still no one came to arrest him. And how did Akechi Kogoro listen to this tale of mine? I had expected that, somewhere along the way, he would betray himself some flicker of expression, some slip of the tongue. To my astonishment, his face remained utterly unmoved. True, he was always one to keep his feelings hidden, but this was calmness carried to an extreme. All the while, he merely ruffled his tangled hair with his fingers, silent. I thought, how brazen this man is, and pressed on to my final point. You will surely ask, then, how the culprit entered and escaped. Certainly, unless that point is clarified, all else is in vain. But alas, for you, I have uncovered the answer to that as well. From the police investigation that night, it appeared there was no trace of entry or exit. Yet murder having occurred, the killer must have entered and left. Therefore, the detectives must have overlooked something. The police, it seems, racked their brains on this puzzle. But, unfortunate for them, they were outdone by a mere student like myself. Nothing complicated, really. I thought, the police have already investigated the neighbors thoroughly, so there must be no suspicious persons among them. In that case, perhaps the culprit had passed openly before their very eyes, but in such a guise that no one thought twice about it. He may even have been witnessed, but in so ordinary a role that no one considered it worth mentioning. In other words, he exploited the blind spot in human attention just as the eye has a blind spot, so too does perception. Like a conjurer who hides a large object before the audience's very eyes, he concealed himself. And where then did my suspicions fall? On the soba shop Asahiya, 2 doors down from the secondhand bookstore. The bookstore was flanked on the right by a clockmaker, then a confectioner, on the left, a haberdasher, and then the soba shop. I went there and asked whether around 8 o'clock that night anyone had come to borrow their toilet. You know the place, its earthen-floored passage runs straight to the back gate, and right beside that gate is the lavatory. So, a man pretending to use the toilet could easily slip out the back, circle round, and return without anyone suspecting. The ice cream vendor at the alley's corner would never notice, and as it was a soba shop, asking to use the lavatory would arouse no suspicion. It so happened that the mistress was absent that evening, and only the master was in the front of the shop, perfect for such a ruse. And indeed, there was a customer who borrowed the lavatory around that very time. Regrettably, the soba seller remembered nothing of his appearance, nor the stripes of his clothing. Still, I lost no time in passing this fact along, through my journalist friend, to Inspector Kobayashi. The inspector himself went to question the soba shop, but learned nothing further. At this I paused, giving Akechi room to reply. At such a point, surely he must say something, anything to defend himself. But he only kept scratching at his tangled hair, composed as ever. So at last, where I had thus far spoken in indirect hints, out of courtesy, I resolved to speak plainly. You understand me, don't you, Akechi? The damning evidence points straight at you. To be honest, deep down I still can't quite bring myself to suspect you, but when the facts line up this way, what choice do I have? I even went so far as to check whether anyone in those row houses owned a boldly striped yukata. After no small trouble, I found that not a single one did. And of course, it makes sense few would wear such a striking pattern, one that would so easily line up with the latticework. And those tricks, the fingerprint trick, the borrowing the lavatory trick, they're ingenious, beyond the reach of anyone but a criminologist like yourself. And above all, isn't it strange? You claim to have been childhood friends with the victim's wife, and yet that night, during the investigation into her background, you sat silent, never once mentioning it. So now, all that's left is your alibi. But that, too, fails. Do you remember? On the way home that night, I asked where you had been before arriving at Hakubaiken, and you answered that you had been strolling nearby for an hour or so. Even if someone had seen you on that walk, what's to stop you from slipping into the soba shop's lavatory along the way? That's hardly unusual. Tell me, Akechi, am I wrong? If you can, let me hear your defense. Readers, what do you think Akechi Kogoro did when I cornered him thus? Did he collapse, head hung in shame? Far from it. He shattered my bold charges in the most unexpected way by bursting out into loud laughter. My apologies, my apologies. I didn't mean to laugh, but you are so very earnest, Akechi said, as though in excuse. Your reasoning is quite entertaining. I'm glad to have found a friend like you. But alas, Your deductions are far too external, too material. Take, for example, my relationship with that woman. Did you ever trouble to look deeper, to consider what kind of childhood friends we were? Whether I had ever been in love with her? Whether I bore her any resentment? Could you not guess even that much? And why did I not speak up that night? Simply because I had nothing of value to add. I had parted from her before even entering elementary school, you see. It was only recently, by chance, that I learned the connection, and we spoke 2 or 3 times, nothing more. Then what of the fingerprint? I pressed. You think I did nothing all this while? I, too, investigated, diligently loitered around D Hill nearly every day, went often to the secondhand bookstore, questioned the husband. Once I admitted to knowing his wife from childhood, it actually made it easier to draw things out of him. Just as you learned from your journalist friend what the police knew, I learned much from the husband himself. That business with the fingerprint, I discovered the truth soon enough. A laughable matter. The filament in the bulb had burned out. No one had turned it off at all. When I twisted the switch, I thought the light had come on, but in my haste I jostled the lamp, and the broken tungsten filament reconnected for a moment. That's all. So naturally, my fingerprint was the only one there. You said that earlier, around 8 o'clock, you saw light through the lattice. Then the filament must have snapped sometime after that. Old bulbs often fail on their own, after all. And as for the discrepancy about the color of the culprit's clothing, well, better than me explaining, let me show you. He dug among the heaps of books around him, rummaging this way and that, until at last he produced a worn foreign volume. Have you read this? Munsterberg's Psychology and Crime. Read the first 10 lines of the chapter on illusions. As I listened to his confident arguments, I began to sense my own blunders. So, obediently, I took the book and began to read. It said, in essence, the following. Once, there had been a case involving an automobile accident. In court, under oath, one witness swore that the road had been completely dry and dusty, while another swore that it had just rained and the road was muddy. One declared the car had been moving slowly. The other said he had never seen a car drive so fast. One claimed there were only 2 or 3 people on the village road. The other insisted there had been crowds of men, women, and children. Both witnesses were respectable gentlemen with nothing to gain from misrepresenting the facts. When I had finished reading, Akechi turned a few more pages and said, "This case is factual. But look here, this chapter on the memory of witnesses. About halfway through, there's an account of an experiment. It concerns the color of clothing, quite relevant to our case. Please, read a little further." The article said, a few years ago, in Göttingen, a scholarly meeting was held, composed of jurists, psychologists, and physicists, men highly trained in observation. It happened that a carnival was in progress in the town. Suddenly, in the midst of the meeting, the door burst open, and a clown in gaudy costume rushed in, pursued by a black man with a pistol in hand. In the middle of the hall, they shouted wild threats at each other, until the clown collapsed to the floor and the pursuer leapt upon him. A shot rang out, and then, in an instant, both of them vanished from the room. The whole episode lasted no more than 20 seconds. The audience was, of course, astonished. No one, save the presiding chair, guessed that the scene had been rehearsed in advance and photographed. The chair, explaining that such matters often arose in court, asked each member present to record exactly what he had seen. Here followed statistics showing how wildly inaccurate the records were. For example, of 40 observers, only 4 correctly stated that the black man had nothing on his head. Others insisted he wore a bowler hat or even a silk hat. His clothing, too, was variously described as red, brown, striped, or coffee-colored. In fact, he had worn white trousers, a black coat, and a large red tie. As Münsterberg so astutely demonstrated, Akechi began, human observation and memory are wholly unreliable. Even trained scholars could not correctly recall the color of a man's clothes. Why should it be strange, then, to think that those students misremembered the color of the intruder's yukata? They may have seen someone, but he was not wearing bold stripes, and certainly not I. Your theory about the lattice and the stripes is clever, amusing even, but isn't it altogether too perfect, too convenient? Would it not be more reasonable for you to trust in my innocence than in such a rare coincidence? As for the matter of the soba shop lavatory, I, too, suspected that passage was the culprit's escape. But when I investigated, I arrived at the opposite conclusion. In truth, no man borrowed that lavatory at all. Readers, you may have already noticed, by denying the testimony, denying the fingerprint, denying even the escape route, Akechi seemed not only to clear himself, but to deny the crime itself. I could not fathom what he was thinking. So you do have an idea of the culprit? I asked. Yes, I do, he answered, scratching his tangled hair. My method differs from yours. Physical evidence can be twisted any way one likes. The best detective method is to probe the inner workings of the human heart. That, however, depends on the detective's own ability. In this case, I placed weight on psychological insight. What first drew my attention was the fact that the bookseller's wife bore numerous fresh wounds on her body. Soon after, I heard whispers that the soba seller's wife bore similar injuries. You knew of that, didn't you? Yet neither husband struck me as a violent man. Both seemed mild, good-natured. That suggested to me some hidden secret. So I began with the bookseller. Since I revealed I had once known his late wife, he let his guard down, and I managed to draw from him a strange fact. Then I turned to the soba seller. He, though, is a far firmer character. It was harder to pry anything from him, but with a certain method, yes, I managed to succeed. You know how, in psychology, the method of association tests has begun to be applied to criminal investigations. The suspect is presented with a series of simple stimulus words, and the examiner measures the speed of his associative responses. But I don't believe it must always be limited to such simple words: dog, house, river, and so forth, as the psychologists say. Nor do I think it always requires the aid of a chronoscope. For someone who grasps the essence of the association test, such formalities are hardly necessary. After all, the famous magistrates and detectives of old, long before psychology had advanced to its present state, were unknowingly practicing precisely this psychological method, guided only by their natural genius. Oka Ekizun no Kami, for example, was surely one such man. In fiction, recall the opening of Poe's Rue Morgue, how Dupin, by watching his friend's movements, could divine the very thoughts in his mind. Doyle imitated it in The Resident Patient, letting Holmes perform a similar deduction. All of these, in a sense, are varieties of association tests. The psychologist's mechanical instruments are nothing more than crutches for ordinary men who lack such native insight. But I digress. I mean to say that, in this sense, I conducted a kind of association test upon the soba seller. I drew him into conversation nothing more than idle chatter and studied his psychological reactions. It is a very delicate matter and a rather complicated one, so I shall not go into detail now. but the result was that I reached a firm conviction. In short, I found the murderer. Yet, there is not a shred of physical evidence. Thus, I cannot bring it before the police. Even if I did, they would hardly take it up. And besides, there is another reason why I have stayed my hand, though I know the culprit. This crime was committed without malice. Strange as it may sound, this murder was done with the victim's consent. Indeed, perhaps even at her own wish. I turned the possibilities over in my mind, but could make nothing of his meaning. Forgetting my shame at my own mistaken reasoning, I listened, rapt, to this bizarre deduction. My conclusion, Akechi continued, is that the killer was the soba seller himself. He invented that tale of a man borrowing the lavatory to cover his tracks. It was not even his own idea. The fault was ours, you and I. By asking such a question, practically suggested it to him. He took us for detectives, you see. And why did he kill? Here, I felt as though the case had forced me to glimpse the hidden underside of life, a realm where lurk secrets so ghastly that one expects to meet them only in nightmares. The soba seller was, by heredity, a cruel, sadistic pervert. By some devilish irony of fate, just one house away lived a woman who was his counterpart, a masochist. The bookseller's wife was as much a lover of pain as he was a lover of cruelty. By the peculiar ingenuity of such diseased natures, they contrive to carry on an illicit liaison under the noses of their unsuspecting spouses. Now, do you understand what I meant when I said it was a murder by mutual consent? Until recently, each had barely managed to satisfy those perverse desires through their lawful spouses. The scars on both the bookseller's wife and the soba seller's wife were proof of this. But, of course, that did not content them. When each discovered, so near at hand, the very partner they had long sought, it is not hard to imagine how swiftly their understanding was formed. Yet the outcome was more than fate's irony could bear. The interplay of passive and active extremes drove their excesses ever further, until at last, that night, they brought about, though neither ever desired it, that fatal event. A shiver ran through me as I heard Akechi's monstrous conclusion. What a case this was. Just then, the tobacco seller's wife from below came upstairs with the evening paper. Akechi took it, glanced at the social column, and, after a moment, sighed softly. At last he could bear it no longer. He has confessed. Curious coincidence, isn't it? That we should be discussing it this very moment, only to be met with this report. I looked where he pointed. There, in a small headline, and scarcely 10 lines of print, was the notice of the soba seller's voluntary surrender.